Good evening, all. Thank you very much for joining us for this Leafcutter Bee talk. So there's a few familiar faces I can see on the chat list, but if you don't know me, my name's Liam Olds. I'm an entomologist based in South Wales, and I've got a particular interest in solitary bees. Quite new, I suppose, to entomology as a whole, but I've been sort of looking at solitary bees now for almost 10 years. So it might sound that I'm quite experienced, but there's a lifetime of learning when it comes to all sort of insects, really. But I've got enough of a grasp on them now, I think, to hopefully, do a bit webinar on them. But yeah, lots and lots to learn, but a fascinating group of insects, and hopefully, you'll sort of learn a bit more about them today. So by way really of overview of what the talk is going to cover, it's going to be kind of an introduction to bees in general, really. Then we kind of have a look at the number of species we've got in the UK and where they kind of fall within, solitary bees, honeybees, bumblebees, and so forth. We'll have a look at the life history of bees as well. So this is just to kind of give you that bit of an introduction to bees as a whole. And then we'll kind of have a look more closely then at the leafcutter bees, which fall within this genus called Megachile. And then we'll kind of have a look at the key identification features, really, for recognizing these leafcutter bees, how you kind of tell the sexes apart, which is really important. If you want to identify them, you need to know if you're looking at a male or a female, because they have different characteristics and different, features that you use to identify them. And then we'll finally then kind of go through our UK species and kind of talk a little bit about the key identification features of those species, where they're found in the UK, the habitats, their sort of favourite flowers they like to visit, that sort of stuff. So that's the general gist, really, of the talk this evening. So by way of an introduction, really, to bees. So bees fall within the insect order Hymenoptera, which are the bees, the wasps, and the ants. And this basically means that they've got, as insects, they've got a three-part body. So they've got a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And then they've also got two pairs of membranous wings. So they've got four wings altogether. So in contrast to something like flies, which have just one pair of wings, bees, and wasps as well, have, four wings altogether, two pairs. And then within the Hymenoptera, then they belong to this superfamily called the Apoidea, which are the bees. And then a little bit of a kind of fun fact, really, is that bees are essentially wasps, I suppose. They kind of evolved from a group of wasps, the hunt thrips, which are tiny little insects that you sometimes see in flowers. So if you look closely at sort of yellow asteraceae, like things like cat's ear and that sort of thing, you sometimes see tiny little, quite often black, little insects in there that are called thrips. And this group of wasps, obviously, at some point, sort of decided, because they loosely, to stop hunting these thrips and instead start collecting pollen to feed their young, and that's give rise to the bees that we kind of know today. And they've been around a long, long time. So they evolved around about 125 million years ago, which is well before the last mass extinction of the dinosaurs. And they've diversified quite a lot. So, in this time now, we've got, over 20,000 species worldwide. So that's 5 times more species of bee than there are mammals on the globe, and 3 times more than there are birds. So a really, really diverse group of insects. The diversity in bees is greatest in arid areas. So like the southern United States has got really, really high bee diversity, for instance. That's kind of where they sort of really are, I suppose. And if you kind of want to kind of define a bee, really, I think this sort of bit of a sort of quote, really, I suppose, really summarizes kind of what a bee essentially is, I suppose. And you could say is an electrostatically charged toolkit that's equipped for gathering, manipulating, and transporting a sort of diversity of different plant-derived products for nest construction and larval provisioning. So what that means is electrostatically charged. That's one of the tools that bees have, really, in order to gather pollen. When they sort of fly in, they build up this electrostatic charge. When they visit flowers, the pollen gets drawn to their body. So that's one way in which they capture pollen to take back to their nest. And then they've got this toolkit, which is a variety of different combs and brushes and baskets and things like that, in order to sort of capture the pollen on their body, in order to transport it back to the nest. But then they also gather some other sort of plant materials sometimes as well, in terms of resins or mud or leaf sections and things like that. And then basically they're collecting the pollen for to provision for their, to provide for their offspring. And then they also use some of these other products like the mud and the leaf section, the resin and stuff for their nest construction. So that bit of a sentence there really sums up kind of what kind of bees are doing, I guess. And in the UK, we've got around about sort of 255 species. So you'll quite often see quotes, that we've got around about 275 species in the UK and stuff. But if you kind of look carefully, I suppose, at those sort of figures, there's a number of species on the British list or UK list that have now gone extinct, unfortunately. So we're left with around about 255 species. And I say approximately because that number's changing a lot, really. And on average, we're adding one new bee species to the UK, annually. So all the change, really. But of those roughly 255 species, we've got one species of honeybee. That's the western honeybee, Apis mellifera. So that's the species is active, throughout the whole of the western sort of Europe. Then we've got 24 species of bumblebees, so we're in quite a good part of the world for bumblebees. And then we've got all the rest then what we call solitary bees. So, solitary bees, because basically anything that's a bee that's not a honeybee or a bumblebee, really. And we have over sort of 230 different species of them. So they're really diverse group of bees, and the leafcutter bees fall within those 230 there. And bees, as you will know, I suppose, bees visit flowers because they wanted to gather the pollen to feed their young. But pollen is also important for the females as well, because it's a protein source, so it's important for in order for them to lay eggs, to produce eggs. But then they also visit in the flowers for the nectar as well, which is that sugar energy source, that fuel that kind of gets them around where they want to go. And because they're regularly visiting flowers, because they've got to gather the pollen to feed their young, then they're really important pollinators as well. So they can be really, really efficient pollinators. And there's always that quote that the red mason bee is 130 times more effective at pollination than a honeybee, for instance, or something along those lines anyway. So, they can be really, really good pollinators. And within the UK, then we've got our 255 species. They fall within 27 different genera. So these are different kind of like groups, you could say, of like closely related species. And they include things like the mining bees and the leafcutter bees and some of the furrow bees, blood bees, things like that. And then those 27 different groups fall within these 6 families. So there's 7 bee families worldwide. And we have representatives within 6 of those families. The 7th family is only found in Australia. But you can see where the Megachile, which are the leafcutter bees, in the blue there, they fall within the Megachile family. So there's a number of closely related genera in there, things like the mason bees and the sharp-tailed bees and things like that, and woolcarder bees. So in terms of the sort of life history of bees, then you have these 3 sort of broad strategies that the bees are adopting. You have solitary bees, and they can be strictly solitary, or they can be communal, where they share the same nest entrance, but they don't interact in any way. Then you've got your social species, which are very much typified by your bumblebee and your honeybee, but it does also include things like the furrow bees. Some of them are social as well. They've got queens and workers. And then you've got your parasitic ones, or your cuckoos then. So you have your cuckoo bumblebees and you have your cuckoo solitary bees that sneak into the nest of their host and lay the eggs and sneak back out, sort of thing. But the leafcutter bees fall within the solitary bees. So they're strictly solitary. So there's no sort of cooperation between females. There's no workers like you get in bumblebees and honeybees, to sort of help defend the nest and raise the offspring and that. So these sort of solitary bees, strictly solitary bees, they comprise the vast majority of bees worldwide, over 75%. And we think of these, really, the females of these, as hardworking single mothers. So they're all capable of producing their own offspring, unlike, for instance, in honeybees and bumblebees, where you have sterile workers that raise offspring that are not their own. So yeah, all the females are capable of producing their own offspring. The females build and maintain their own nests as well. and then they go out and do all the foraging that are necessary to provide for their offspring. So gathering all of that sort of pollen and nectar and stuff like that. And they typically live alone, but then some of them sort of have communal nests where they share the same nest entrance, but they don't cooperate in any way. So we think of the females of these as hardworking single mothers. They have quite a tough life, I think, personally. And then looking at the Megachile now, the leafcutter bees in sort of more detail, there's around about 1,500 species worldwide, so they're a really diverse group. The diversity in leafcutter bees, I think, is greatest in the tropics, or certainly in the hotter climates anyway. And they have a worldwide distribution, apart from the obvious places, I suppose, like Antarctica and some of the very cold places like Greenland and Iceland and the Arctic and so forth. But they're generally sort of found in almost every sort of terrestrial or land-based habitat. And they're called leafcutter bees commonly because they're collecting leaf sections in order to line their nest, basically, especially the partitions and the walls of their nest. But they will also use resin as well, and some use mud. So it does kind of vary slightly between the various species. But a lot of them nest sort of within sort of pithy sort of stems, like thinking of things like bramble, things like that. What else would they use? Like ragwort stems, that sort of thing. But they'd also sort of nest in like dead wood and other sort of naturally occurring sort of holes. But then some of them nest in the ground as well. So we have a mix really of ground nesting and what we call sort of aerial nesters that are nesting in sort of pre-existing holes elsewhere. But a lot of people come into contact with leafcutter bees in their garden quite often. You know, they're quite a urban, suburban sort of species. They do quite well in those locations. They take advantage of all of the sort of, you know, the walls and other sort of stuff we got around, man-made objects where there's cavities and all in front of the nest and bee hotels and things like that. And then, you know, you often see evidence of leafcutter bees in gardens where they've been cut in leaf sections. So, you know, they use a variety of different sort of shrubs, you know, flowering plants, trees, in order to sort of cut the leaf sections. And it can be, you know, commonly used things are things like rosebud willow herb. What other stuff is really well used? Buddleia is used quite a lot. Rose is used quite a lot. Enchanter's nightshade is used quite a bit. So, you know, so there's some of like examples of some of the plants really. And you've seen in these pictures where females, we've got a female on the top left there that is actually cutting a leaf section there. But you can see all of those kind of semicircular shapes is kind of where the females have come and cut the section of leaf, and then they'll take that back to the nest then. And then in the top right there, you've got showing basically a nest really of leafcutter bees, where you've got this long cylindrical, almost looks like a cigar, and it's got all the various little leaf sections you can see all stuck down there. And then basically there's linear sequences where you have the females go further inwards. So if you've got a bee hotel, for instance, then the females will be further at the back. The males will be at the front because the males emerge earlier before the females, so they tend to go at the front. Yeah, so you have that long cigar basically is divided up into segments, and there'll be a little ball of pollen with a bit of nectar, and then the female will lay an egg, and then they'll be developing within there then. But yeah, amazing things anyway. In terms of the features then of leafcutter bees, Megachile, they fall within the long-tongued bees. So you can separate bees out globally, basically, according to the features of their mouth parts. And yeah, essentially the leafcutter bee, the Megachile family, are some of the long-tongued bees, and they share features of their mouth parts in common with Apidae, which is another really big sort of family. So they're long-tongued. They've got scopa, which is the technical term for a pollen brush. They have that on the underneath of the abdomen. So you can kind of see that in this picture on the bottom left there. So the pollen brush is a dense covering of hairs, and that's kind of where they capture the pollen to take back to the nest. So in contrast to a lot of other solitary bees, like a lot of the sort of furrow bees the mining bees and stuff that have this pollen brush on their hind legs. It's on the underneath the abdomen in leafcutter bees. That's a really good kind of feature for identifying them, but it's a feature that's also shared by other members of the Megachile family as well, like the mason bees as well. But this is a female-only characteristic because females are the only ones collecting the pollen. The males don't have to collect pollen, so they don't have this pollen brush. Another feature then to look for is in the wing veins. So you can kind of have a look carefully at this, and you can kind of see that in a Megachile and in the Megachile family as a whole, they've got these two submarginal cells. So that's the two. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the two little cells there right at the top of the wing. So that'll be sort of three. There'll be three there in some other bees, like the furrow bees, the sort of mining bees, that sort of stuff. So, you know, having a good look at the wings can sometimes help to confirm that it is within the Megachile family as well, but it is very difficult to see wing veins, you know, on a living bee. So it's not necessarily essential anyway to kind of look at that. So other features they also have, again, a really difficult feature to see unless you've got a specimen or a very, very good photo, is looking at the claws, where basically they've got these little claws that lack teeth. So they're very smooth claws, and then they're missing this pad really between the claws. So in other bees, you have this large sort of pad here, and it's basically not present in this picture. So that's a feature that only the leafcutter bees, only the Megachile sort of have. So that's really, really useful as well. But again, really difficult to see unless you've got a specimen. And then they got the mandibles then are very large, which is obviously an adaptation to cutting leaf sections. And they've also got a number of different teeth. So you can see in this photo here, in the top left there, you can see how they're very large jaws with lots of pointy little teeth on them. Excuse me. And then another thing they've also got then are these sort of bands of quite light coloured hairs on the abdomen. In contrast to like a lot of our mason bees, for instance, in the UK, where you get, you know, their bodies can be quite metallic. They can be sort of bright green, quite bright blue, that sort of stuff. The leafcutter bees are generally sort of large, but quite drab, sort of brownish sort of bees, really. Quite big head, quite big jaws, but then they do have these sort of lightish sort of colour bands on the abdomen. And then in terms of our UK species, so thankfully we haven't got a huge number of species, which makes it a little bit easier when it comes to identification, but it is still, you know, a little bit of a challenge to get your head around, especially if you're, you know, first time looking at bees, at identifying them. But we have our 7 species, which are all kind of listed here. But then there's also, we have 3 other species that are on the sort of UK list, but unfortunately they've now believed to be extinct. So, you know, so sadly, you know, some things have gone over the years, but we still got 7 to play with at the moment. So that's kind of what we're going to do really, is kind of go through those sort of 7 species and have a look at the kind of key features really of identifying those. But one kind of useful thing with having just those 7 species, you can kind of look at the habitats associated with them, and you can also, you know, think about the nesting habitats of them, and you can kind of separate them out quite nicely as well with some of them. So that makes identification a bit easier sometimes, because, you know, the behavior of them or the habitat they're in, you know, can sort of narrow down the options really when it comes to trying to work out what leafcutter bee you're looking at. So with our sort of aerial nesters, the ones that are using pre-existing cavities, we have 4 species that kind of, you know, regularly kind of use those sort of habitats. And that's Centennicularis, which is the patchwork leafcutter bee, Lignoseca, which is the wood carving leafcutter bee, Versicolor, which is the brown-footed leafcutter bee, and Willoughbyella, which is Willoughby's leafcutter bee. And then we've also got then some species that are ground nesting, and they're associated with sandy soils. And we have 3 species that kind of do that, which are Circumcincta, which is the black-headed, Leachella, which is the silvery leafcutter bee, and Maritima, which is a coast leafcutter bee. So that's quite handy in itself sometimes. It's just, you know, once you get familiar with the habitats that they're associated with and where they nest, then you can sometimes narrow it down. You know, if you're on a sand dune, then you'd expect more of these sort of, you know, these 3 species, maybe less likely to encounter the other ones. And then if you're well inland, nowhere near sort of sandy soils, then of course you might rule out these 3 if you're trying to identify a leafcutter bee. So that's quite useful. One of the greatest things I personally find about leafcutter bees is the fact when it comes to the males, is the fact that you've got three species that have got these amazingly swollen, expanded sort of front tarsi, or front sort of feet. And that's really useful because if you've only got three species that got those, then if you're seeing a male that haven't got those, then that must be one of the other four. So that's a really nice way to separate out the males as well, really. So that's a really, really handy thing. And these kind of pictures really kind of show what that kind of looks like, really. So instead of it just being kind of a normal sort of quite narrow little segments of the feet, the sort of the segment that's closest to the tibia, called the basitarsus or basal sort of tarsal segment, that's really swollen and white. It's got this fringe of really long hairs, but then all of the other little segments, so there's 5 segments in the feet, in the tarsi of bees. They're also quite expanded, or at least 4 of them altogether, including the basitarsus, is quite swollen. Yeah, and got this really long fringe. So I like to personally think of them as mittens. So if you're seeing a bee with little mittens, then you know it's going to be like a leafcutter bee male of one of these 3 species. In the UK, it would be different in other parts of the world, where there might be additional species. But yeah, that's really, really handy, personally, I think. And just to really explain, I suppose, why have they got this sort of feature? So there's a number of different sort of, I suppose, how do I describe it? Sort of, they got like pheromone sort of little pores, I suppose, that release these sort of lovely little smells. So when the males are mating with the females, they can sort of put these little mittens, I suppose, on the female's sort of head. They release their little chemicals, to sort of like perfume, I suppose you could say, to sort of entice her to mate. And then they also use that kind of like fringe of long hairs in order to like cover her eyes and stroke her. So it's like a nice little kinky little thing, really, that leafcutter bee males kind of do, which is really nice. But then we've also got those 4 species I mentioned that haven't got those kind of swollen front feet. And this is kind of what, in that bottom left picture, shows kind of what a normal, I suppose, tarsi front feet would look like in the other species. So you can see how kind of obvious those kind of big white mittens are. So yeah, if you've seen a bee that you recognize as a male and they haven't got those swollen sort of front feet, then it'd be one of the other 4 species. I should have said on the previous slide, the 3 species that have got those swollen sort of front feet are Circumcincta, which is a black-headed leafcutter bee, Maritima, which is a coast leafcutter bee, and Willoughby, which is Willoughby's leafcutter bee. So 2 of those 3 species are associated with sandy soils, so that's black-headed and coast. And then Willoughby is a really common species that's associated with all sorts of different habitats, but especially sort of inland habitats, and it's no reliance on sandy habitats. So quite often, the vast majority of places where you are in the UK, if you're seeing a bee with those mittens and is a male, it's very likely to be Willoughby. And it's only really if you're in really sandy habitats and you might then start to consider some of the others, but we'll touch on that later on. And then the 4 species that have got the normal front feet, then they are Centrum calaris, which is patchwork, Leafcutter, which is a silvery leafcutter bee, Lignus seca, which is the wood carving, and the versicolor, which is the brown-footed. So they're the 4 that have got normal feet in the males. And then when it comes to differentiating the sexes, you've got a female on the left there, male on the right. The females are generally larger. The most obvious thing, I suppose, really, is the females have got a pollen brush underneath the abdomen, which the males won't have. So males will have some hair underneath the abdomen, but it won't be nowhere near like a dense sort of brush, and it won't be colourful like you get in a lot of the species as well. It won't be like orange that you get quite often. Yeah, so that's kind of one feature. But then there's a number of other features you can use to separate males and females. Of course, you can look for the expanded front feet in some of the males, but of course, not all of the males have that. But generally, yeah, the females are bigger, larger, stockier. Males are sort of smaller, slimmer. They've got the pollen brush in the females. You haven't got a pollen brush in the males. The females have more antennal segments. They have 12, whereas 12 in the female, 13 in the male. But unless you've got a specimen, or you can, got a really, really good camera, you won't really kind of see that. The abdomen also has 6 visible segments in the female and 7 in the male. Again, really difficult to see, especially when you've got sort of body hairs, but you might be able to just about do it on a on a good quality photograph. But probably one of the more useful things, I think, is certainly behavior, really, because females will be the ones kind of cutting the leaf sections. If you see any of them cutting leaf sections, it's going to be a female. See any of them with, a lot of pollen underneath the abdomen, then it's going to be a female. If you're getting them kind of going into nests, whether it's with pollen or leaf sections, or excavating a nest in dead wood or anything like that, then I'll be a female again, because they're doing all the foraging and nest building. And then the males are quite often just hanging around, I guess. So you often see sort of males just around, like bee hotels, for instance, just around the nest, just patrolling quite often. So if you're seeing them kind of flying around, almost defending the territory, really, just whizzing around, that's more than likely to be a male. If you go to patches of flowers, you'll see males just, generally just kind of following the same route around and round, just waiting for a female to come along that hopefully hasn't been mated and mate up with her. So there's certain behaviors you can kind of look for in sort of separating males and females as well. But I suppose females are the ones that are more regularly encountered, because they're often the ones you see at the nest and in gardens. That's the ones you kind of see, bringing the leaf sections back and things like that. So just kind of go through now our sort of like 7 species, really, and I'm going to kind of do them alphabetically according to their scientific name. So I'm going to start with Centrum calaris, which is the patchwork leafcutter bee, which is a relatively small species, or small to medium size. And when you kind of read the books, you'll sort of see terms like large or medium or small used, and you might have no context as to what that kind of means, really. But it's only when you become familiar with some of the other species you kind of realize what is small and what's large. But this is kind of on the smaller end of our leafcutter bees in terms of size. It's a very common species throughout much of sort of lowland Britain, and it's also on the Channel Islands as well. When it becomes into sort of Scotland, then it becomes a lot more sporadic. The records are a bit more sparse. And then in Ireland is widespread across the country, but is pretty localized, so it's very patchy in its distribution. But is generally sort of found in a really wide variety of different habitats, including gardens. Again, it's like a lot of leafcutter bees, it nests in sort of pre-existing cavities in things like dead wood and walls, other sort of man-made objects as well. It will also use hollow plant stems as well, so things like bramble. And then bee hotels basically mimic, I suppose, the naturally occurring holes in sort of hollow plant stems. So it will use bee hotels like it is in this picture here. And it is sort of up there really as some of our more frequent sort of leafcutter bees to use bee hotels. But there are others that use them, but it is quite a common one in a garden setting, which is quite nice. And then this is the kind of map showing the distribution. Ireland isn't really, on there properly as it should be, because this is data from the Beeswax Lands Recording Society, which covers basically the UK rather than necessarily the Republic of Ireland. But you can kind of see is a very widespread species. All of those little green dots, the darker the colour, the more recent the record, paler the colour, the older the record. But you can see there's a lot and lots of records all across, well, much of England, Wales. It gets a bit more patchy as you get up into northern England, and very patchy as you get into Scotland, but very widespread species. And the females can construct up to about 30 sort of brood cells, so each brood cell would have one sort of egg laid and one larvae. So 30 of them during their lifetime, and they partition the cell walls, or they create the cell walls and then the partitions out of leaf sections, like a lot of other leafcutter bees do. And they use various materials for that. And the flight period is roughly about sort of mid-June to early September, but it does vary quite a lot. So, we have unusual years where you get earlier individuals, and then other years where they're late. But as a general rule, it's around that sort of time. And that kind of is the case for a lot of leafcutter bees. A lot of them are summer active species. So whereas things like the mining bees are very heavily spring active, with some summer active ones, the leafcutter bees are generally all sort of summer active. You could get them towards the end of spring, but generally summer species. And it's a polyleptic species, which means that it visits a wide variety of different sort of plant families in order to collect pollen. But it especially likes things like bramble, excuse me, thistles, knapweeds, ragworts, common fleabane, cat's ear, that sort of thing. Yeah, so those kind of, yeah, Asteraceae sort of family is quite important, especially yellow ones, but not always yellow ones. But yeah, Asteraceae family, the daisy family is kind of really, really important sort of food plant for them. And then when it comes to identifying these sort of patchwork leafcutter bees, we're going to separate out the males and females because they've got different sort of characteristics used. But for the females, one of the features you'll see, so if you've got Stephen Faulk's Field Guide to the Bees of Britain and Ireland, you'll see that there's an identification key which kind of goes through as like step-by-step process really for identifying all the different sort of species. And you'll see kind of one of the earlier things he talks about really is having these sort of upright sort of hairs on turgid 6, which is the very sort of tip of the abdomen. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that very sort of tip of the abdomen there. So if there's long hair sticking upright from there, then, you know, that's kind of useful for identifying 3 species, and then in the females, and then in the other sort of remaining 4 species, then the hairs will be very sort of short and flattened and stuck to the surface. And I'll show a picture to sort of explain that a little bit more. But in the patchwork leafcutter bee, they have these upright hairs basically on that sort of turgid 6, the very tip of the abdomen in the females. They have quite well developed white bands on the abdomen. You can see in that picture there, you can see a very nice sort of obvious sort of white bands on the abdomen. The pollen brush is orange haired right to the tip. So that's the kind of one of the really key identification features for this species, is that females have got an all orange pollen brush. So it's orange all the way along, including right at the tip. So in a number of other species, it's black haired at the tip. So it might be orange partly and then black at the tip, or it might be like a buff sort of off-white and then goes black, you know, but in this one, all orange. So really, really key thing. The only thing to be aware of is anyone is watching this from Ireland, the Irish populations of another species, the brown-footed versicolor, can have an all orange pollen brush as well, but they have the flattened hairs on that turgid 6, whereas this species, you know, has upright hairs. So that's something to be aware of. And then the other thing then really is, so they've got all orange pollen brush, and then that pollen brush then also sort of extends onto the sides, so it almost comes up and over and onto the sides of the abdomen, so that in top view, like on this picture, you end up kind of getting this orange sort of halo or circle that goes around the abdomen. So it's a very obvious sort of pollen brush that basically you can kind of see all the way around the sides of the abdomen. So looking for that orange halo is really key. And then, yeah, all orange pollen brush. So really, really kind of key kind of features for identifying the females. When I talked about those kind of upright hairs, this sort of picture just kind of shows that really. So you've got this final segment here, which is turgid 6 right at the top. And I know it's not the best photo in the world, but you can kind of see these upright hairs there. And the fact it's got upright hairs would narrow it down basically. And it would be one of 3 species. But to be honest, you know, if you've got a clear view of that pollen brush and it's all orange, then it's going to be this species anyway. But, you know, that's kind of one of the key features used in some of the keys and stuff. Something to be really wary of when it comes to identifying leafcutter bee females is pollen on the pollen brush. So the pollen can really obscure the color of the actual hairs on the pollen brush. So you might have the leafcutter bee female collecting orange pollen, for instance, you know, but the actual hairs underneath might be a darker color, and it might just be the pollen you're looking at. So really, you kind of want to see like a fresh female that hasn't got pollen, you know, on the pollen brush. Yeah, in an ideal world, essentially, it makes it a lot harder when they've got loads and loads of pollen on the pollen brush and you can't see the color of them, of that pollen brush. This picture just kind of shows that sort of turgid 6 again, that apical segment of the abdomen. You can see the long hairs sticking up right there. So that's the kind of feature, if you're not familiar with it or you've seen it in the key and didn't really kind of know what it meant. In terms of the males, then males are quite difficult, I suppose. The males haven't got those expanded front feet, so that's quite useful because you can rule out 3 species straight away then, you know, that have got those expanded front feet. So basically there's silvery leafcutter bee, the Lignoseca, which is the wood carving leafcutter bee, and then you also have versicolor as well, and Centrum calaris, which is this one. So there's 4 species that, you know, have got the normal sort of darkened and modified front feet. And then within those, then the tip of the abdomen in one species has got this sort of big sort of V-shaped notch, and we'll see that later on. This species doesn't have it. So that's kind of one useful thing to rule out one species there. And what it looks most similar to is versicolor, which is that brown-footed leafcutter bee. And to be honest, unless you're willing to sort of collect a specimen, or you can get a male within a glass pot and you can kind of see a clear view of his underside and perhaps take a picture, you're basically just going to have to say it's either Centrum calaris or versicolor if you're seeing the males of these without that clear view of the underside of the abdomen. So this is just kind of a male Centrum calaris specimen, but it just kind of shows that tip of the abdomen, that it hasn't got this really obvious V-shaped notch that you'll see later on in Lignoseca, the wood carving leafcutter bee. So yeah, so it hasn't got that. And then this is the underside of the abdomen. And one of the features you use to separate Centrum calaris from versicolor is the fact that there's these obvious fringes in Centrum calaris and the patchwork leafcutter bee that go along these segments on the underside of the abdomen. But the key thing is this segment here, which is sternite 4, I think it is. So the segment number 4 on the underside is sort of really dull because it's got all these little microscopic hairs that sort of don't reflect the light really. So it's like really, really dull. And then in the other species, in versicolor, it's very, very shiny. So very, very difficult to see. So a lot of you on this call, no doubt, will just be kind of wanting to record some of the bees in your garden and stuff, and you're not going to want to take sort of specimens and stuff. So as long as you're kind of, happy not to always get a definite ID sometimes, then that's fine. But the females, luckily, are distinctive in this species, so you might not have to get to the point where you have to collect a male and kind of have a look at this sort of feature anyway. Yeah, so that's the patchwork leafcutter bee. So all orange pollen brush in the females, and then the males then, yeah, I've got a number of different features, but unmodified front feet is kind of a useful thing to narrow it down. And you'll see as we go through each of the species, I'll kind of go through all the familiar features, and it'll be a process of elimination eventually when you come to identify them yourself. But anyway, in terms of black-headed leafcutter bee, so this is Megachile circumcincta. This is another one of our species. This is sort of a medium to large size species that's widely distributed throughout the UK and also present on the Channel Islands, not present in Ireland. It is in Scotland though. And this is a species that we're really worried about. So it's undergone a really widespread decline, especially in southern England, perhaps less so elsewhere, but is, yeah, really, really struggling. Is probably our least common leafcutter bee. So it's unlikely to come across it, but obviously there will be places that it is present. But this is one of our sandy habitat species. So this is found on coastal dunes, coastal brownfield sites, and heathland, anywhere that is quite sandy soils. This is the distribution of that species. You can see is very, very patchy. A lot of the light green dots is kind of where it hasn't been recorded for a long, long time. So you can see there's a lot of places in southern England and also central England where it hasn't been recorded for a long, long time. But, it's doing okay in its few places is known in Wales, for instance, and some of the northeast coast of England and some of the places in northern Scotland and so forth. But this is a species, yeah, sort of associated with sandy habitats. It nests in sandy grounds, especially sort of south-facing banks and slopes. Is usually sort of active from about May through to about early August. So it's a little bit earlier than I suppose some of our leafcutter bees, but not by much. But I have, on one instance, seen them in sort of late April. So in some years where it's very warm, they can be out earlier. But this is another sort of polylectic species, which means it visits a wide variety of different sort of plant families. But, it particularly likes the Fabaceae, the sort of pea family. So especially things like birds-foot trefoils, brooms, red sparrows. But it will also use the Asteraceae, the daisy family, so things like the thistles and the knapweeds. And it will also use things like bramble as well. And again, like all the other leafcutter bees, it uses leaf sections in its nest. And it will use things like roses, and it's also been known to use birch trees, the leaf section from birch trees. But it probably uses a lot of other things as well. And in terms of the identification of these, So the kind of key thing, I suppose, really, is the fact that their abdomen in the females hasn't got these really obvious sort of whitish sort of bands. So there's hair bands on there, you can see, but they're not those really like short, quite bright white little bands, especially on those kind of last sort of 3 segments towards the tip of the abdomen. So it hasn't got those. So you'll see those bands in a lot of the other species. Another thing that gives it its common name, really, black-headed leafcutter bee, they have these sort of jet black hairs on the head. So that's quite a useful characteristic as well, and makes them fairly distinct if you see them nice and fresh. So that sort of dark head contrasts quite nicely then with the sort of paler brown on the thorax. And then also their abdomen then is sort of like paler hairs for the first sort of 3 segments towards the base, closer to the thorax. And then you have these darker hairs then on the other segments towards the tip of the abdomen. So you have this contrast between lighter hairs and darker hairs on the abdomen. That's another really useful feature. They've also got like a sort of tawny sort of color, like an orangey color pollen brush that goes black at the tip that we see in a number of other leafcutter bees. And then, yes, they've also got quite, I suppose, slightly longer sort of body hair. If you get really familiar with the length of the body hairs in some of these things, they are a bit more like fluffier, I suppose, than some of the other leafcutter bees, but it can be quite difficult to see that. But you kind of look into the fact that they've got this unbanded abdomen, this really dark head, you know, that sort of paler hairs on the abdomen, you know, for the sort of first few segments, and then darker towards the tip of the abdomen. Yeah, that's kind of like the key features, really. But a habitat would be a really useful clue, really. If you're in sandy habitats, you know, then this would be on your radar a bit more. If you're getting this, you know, well inland in, I don't know, acidic habitats, you know, and no sand nearby or something, then, you know, it's very unlikely it's going to be that. So, yeah, so it's unlikely a lot of people kind of see this, especially in like a garden setting. But you know, be mindful of it. The males of these are one of the 3 species got those expanded white feet. So yeah, you can kind of see that in the bottom left there, but basically their feet aren't as expanded as the other species. So the basitarsus, the basal segment of the feet of the tarsi, is basically slightly narrower than the tibia, whereas in the other species it's wider than the tibia. But yeah, again, it's, you know, it's something that a lot of you probably won't come across, but do be mindful of the species when you're in sandy habitats like heathlands and sand dunes. Silvery leafcutter bee, Megachile leachella. This is our smallest leafcutter bee. It's a really tiny little thing. And this is a widespread species around the coastline of sort of southern Britain. And you also get in the Channel Islands as well. It's not present in Scotland, unfortunately, or Ireland. And it's a largely coastal species, but you can get it inland on some sort of like southern heaths and stuff down in the southeast. But it's a sandy habitat species, you know, especially like sort of coastal dunes, nests in sandy soils, and they can form really quite large nesting aggregations sometimes. So they nest in quite closely together in areas of sandy soil, and they can be really noisy, and they fly with a really high pitched buzz, like you get in some of the sort of the flower bees, Anthoptera, the flower bees. They also fly with like quite a high pitched buzz as well. But yeah, they're really quite noisy little things. And this is a map showing the distribution, really, where they're found. You see on the Channel Islands there, right around the coast, really, of southern England, and also parts of Wales as well on the coast, and then up as far roughly as about Lancashire then. And this is active from around about late May again through to about early September. It visit a wide variety of different plants, but especially like those legumes, those Fabaceae, again, the pea family, things like birds of trefoil. Rest tarots is probably the plant that I mostly associate with this species, clovers as well. They'll also visit things like sea holly and stonecrops and bramble and loads of other things as well. And again, use various sort of plants in order to line their nests, but quite often, you know, it'll be things like alders. They'll use traveler's joy, what's also known as old man's beard, I think, isn't it? Roses, willows, all sort of manner of things. I don't think they're particularly fussy, a lot of these leafcutter bees, when it comes to what leaf sections they want. The males, I'll start with the females actually. When it comes to the females and identifying the females, so the female is in the bottom left of this picture here. Really distinctive species, thankfully, this one is in both the male and the female. In the female in the bottom left there, they've got these really strong, quite white bands on the abdomen. They've got a silver or whitish sort of pollen brush underneath the abdomen. You might just about be able to see from that picture. So that's what gives it a common name, Silvery leafcutter bee. So the only leafcutter bee with that sort of like silver or white sort of pollen brush. The females have also got these two little tiny little like white sort of hair patches right at the tip of the abdomen that you can see in that picture as well. So again, that's a feature that only this species got in the UK. So there's a number of different features you can go on there just to recognize the females, as well as the small size and the fact they're in sandy habitats. And then with the males, then really there are only sort of leafcutter bee males that have got really, really bright green eyes. So you will see some that have got bits of green on their eyes. But this is like ridiculously green eyes, I guess. So in the top left, they've got a lovely male there with lovely green eyes. He's also got bands on the abdomen. They're not quite that silvery, I guess. They're more like a very light brown or golden. But yeah, very strongly banded abdomen, bright green eyes, small size, sandy habitats, you know, it's all shouting basically, Silvery leafcutter bee. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful species. Another species to come on to is Ligniseca, which is a wood carving leafcutter bee. So this is a large species now, so it's significantly bigger than you know, the sort of silvery leafcutter bee we just looked at, bigger than the patchwork one we've looked at as well. So these females are quite a bit bigger than like a honeybee. You know, honeybee is quite a big bee really, in comparison to a lot of solitary bees. But this is a widespread species across England and Wales. Becomes a bit more patchy really in the west and the north. It's not known from the Channel Islands, which is surprising. And then in Scotland, it's only really found at the very sort of southeast of the country. And in Ireland, really, it's only known from an old sort of 1979 record. So very, very rare, if not extinct, in Ireland. But it's associated with various sort of habitats, including gardens. And it typically nests in dead wood. So you've got a picture on the top left there of a female using a hole within a tree. So that's kind of typical habitat for them. I think, you know, as well as trees, they use things like fence posts and other bits of dead wood. And they could call wood carving because the females actually will, if the nest isn't quite the right diameter for them, they will use their jaws to sort of excavate, I suppose, and make the hole bigger, and then they create large amounts of like sawdust then that comes out. So sometimes you'll have, you know, your bee hotel, for instance, and the hole might not be quite big enough, and if you see a large pile of sawdust underneath, it'll probably be one of these species that have gone in and sort of excavated and, you know, sort of enlarged the hole a bit. So they're really big, sort of large heads, powerful jaws. And they'll use kind of the largest sort of holes generally in bee hotels around the sort of 10mm size. And this map kind of shows again from the Beeswax Acorn Society where it's found. So you can see right way up to Scotland, but it becomes very, very patchy as you kind of go north, really beyond sort of Lancashire sort of area. Very, very patchy in the southwest and in parts of Wales as well. But this is like all the other species, really a summer species, active from about early June, roughly to sort of early September-ish. Again, polylectic, they're not fussy on what plants they visit, but they do really like Asteraceae, daisy family again. And they particularly like the thistles. So spear thistle is kind of a really good one. But we'll also use sort of musk thistle, woolly thistle. Spear thistle is one of the main ones I see them on, as well as burdocks, really like burdocks, like it is in this picture here, and things like knapweeds. So that's kind of some of his favorite plants to collect pollen from. And then it's known to use sycamore leaves in order to line the nest, but he'll also use other stuff, no doubt, as well. But there's not a huge amount of information out there on what some of these leafcutter bees use in the UK in order to line their nests. When it comes to identifying this, the size is useful, but again, it takes a little bit of practice to know what's sizable and what's not sizable. But it's a large, robust species with a pretty large head in respect to their body. The pollen brush is quite pale at the base, so it's kind of a off-white, I suppose, closer to the thorax. And then it's sort of, I like to think that it becomes like a little bit more orange towards the tip and then becomes black. So it's like almost like three-toned. But the fact that it's really quite pale at the base and then dark at the top is quite a useful ID feature that you get in relatively few other leafcutter bees have got that feature. the tip of the abdomen, tergite 6 as well in the females, is quite blunt. So it's like, yeah, very, very flattened at the top. So it's not kind of going to a point like you get in versicolor females. And I suppose that's probably the main kind of features really of them. Large size, yeah, that pollen brush pale at the base, becoming black at the tip. Yeah, sort of blunt sort of tip to the abdomen as well. Visiting quite often, you know, things like your knapweeds, your bird dogs, that sort of thing, is, yeah, very useful. When it comes to the males then the males, again, haven't got those mittens. They haven't got the expanded front feet. So there'll be 1 of 4 different species that have got normal, I suppose, feet. The tip of the abdomen on them have got this really quite obvious V-shaped notch, though, which kind of makes them a little bit more distinctive. So you can see the male, the top left there, you know, he's haven't really got a huge number of features going for him. He haven't got the mittens, you know, so nothing really obvious there. But he'll be large, so that's quite useful because a lot of our other large species have got the mittens, and this one hasn't got the mittens. So yeah, hasn't got the mittens. And then you can see the tip of the abdomen. Then it's got this V-shaped notch, which is a very useful feature. So it's a V-shaped notch in combination with not having the mittens on the front feet is how you would identify the males of these. Because some of the other leafcutter bee males might have a V-shaped notch, but then they will have mittens, you know, at the front. So something to bear in mind. So that's Lychnis seca. Maritima, the coast leafcutter bees, is another quite large species that's widespread around the coastline of southern Britain. Goes about as far as southwest of Scotland, and then it's also present in the Channel Islands. In Ireland, is very much restricted to the southeast. As you can gather from the common name, is a largely coastal species, but you can get it inland, again, on sort of more those sort of like heathland sort of sites, but also in some sandy brownfield sites. So like in Shropshire, for instance, we've got a lot of those big sand pits, you know, sand quarries. That's kind of where you'd associate that species as well. It nests in sandy ground, often sort of south-facing banks and slopes. That's general kind of rule with bees. They love sort of south-facing banks and slopes. They can form quite large nesting aggregations as well, where they're all nesting in the same place. It's a sort of early July to late August sort of species, so a similar sort of time frame to a lot of the other leafcutter bees. And you can see with the distribution there, how they kind of go right around the coast from Norfolk, I suppose, all the way around up beyond Lancashire, then and then a little bit in Ireland, then on the very southeast. And it's polylectic, so there's a wide variety of different plant families, especially the Fabaceae, the sort of the legumes, the pea family. So birds of trefoils, rest towers, vetches, everlasting peas, they're all, you know, good plants for it. Also the Asteraceae, again, the daisy family, so your ragworts, your knapweeds, your thistles, your common fleabane, that sort of thing. And then a plant that I strongly associate with this species as well is sea holly. So that's kind of what I commonly see on sand dunes. You know, this is kind of what they largely use as well. And then it's known to use willows and also houndstone as well, in order to, you know, cut the leaf sections, but it will no doubt use a lot of other different things as well. But you'll see a regular occurring theme really with amongst the leafcutter bees, how they really love these Asteraceae, which includes a number of plants we associate as weeds like ragworts and thistles. You know, really kind of important plants for them. And then when it comes to identifying the females of the coast leafcutter bee, they're large, robust species again. So very much like the Lychnis seca, the wood carving one. They've got these upright hairs at the tip of the abdomen, like you get in Willoughby's leafcutter bee, the Patchwork leafcutter bee, and the black-headed leafcutter bee. They've got the top of the thorax and the head is usually quite substantially dark, and you see that in the top picture. Even though there's a leaf obscuring part of the abdomen, you can see how really short and like short black hairs, very dark hairs you've got on top of the thorax there, and also on top of the head a bit as well. But the top of the thorax especially can be really dark in some of these Maritima females, which I tend to use as kind of a main ID clue, really. Sandy habitats, you know, you've seen a very dark, you know, haired leafcutter bee, you know, that's really useful. But some of them have got paler hairs, which makes it a little bit harder on top of the thorax. It's also worth bearing in mind, really, some of the Irish populations and the Isle of Man populations of versicolor, the brown-footed, also have quite dark hairs on the thorax as well. So that's a little bit more difficult. But then they don't have the upright hairs on Turgite 6, so that's, so there are ways around it as well. And then the other thing is then that they've got these obvious pale hair bands on the abdomen, which is not quite clear from these photographs, which you won't get in Circumcincta, the black-headed one you've seen earlier. That's also present in sandy habitats. The pollen brush is quite white at the base, and then it goes a little bit orange and black. So like we've seen in the Lignoseca in the wood carving leafcutter bee, so it's quite similar to that in terms of the pollen brush colour. But Lignoseca's got flattened hairs on Turgite 6, and you wouldn't really associate with sandy habitats. It might be there, but it doesn't nest in sandy soil. So, you know, it's more or less likely, I suppose, to encounter that species in sandy habitats. You know, more likely be Maritima, the coast leafcutter bee. And then also the front tarsi, the front feet have got these quite long fringes of hairs, which is really, you know, quite difficult to see unless you've got a really good picture, but they're longer basically than they are in things like Willoughby females. But, you know, habitat is the kind of the main thing. You know, they've got upright hairs on Turgite 6 right at the tip of the abdomen, you know, the color of the pollen brush, you know, sandy habitats. That's kind of like the key kind of features really for the coast leafcutter bee. The males are very distinctive, easier than the females really. So the males are one of the 3 species that got those expanded front feet. So you can see the mittens at the front there. They've got quite green eyes as well. So could slightly be mistaken for the silvery leafcutter bee, but, you know, not quite as green, but, you know, could be. But they've got the mittens, whereas the silvery leafcutter bee haven't got the mittens. Quite gingery body hairs in the males as well, but the key thing is really they've got the mittens with these really swollen hind tibias. So you can see how that's really curved and really like flat basically. So that's really useful because the other 2 male species have got males with the little mittens, you know, haven't got these swollen hind tibias. So looking for swollen hind tibias together with the mittens, essentially, for identifying the males, again in sandy habitats as well. That's kind of what would all point towards that species. Brown-footed leafcutter bee is a little bit more on the smaller side, so a little bit more like your patchwork leafcutter bee, that first species we covered. Very widespread species across Britain and Ireland, but not present in the Channel Islands, and very much restricted more towards the southwest in Scotland. Associated with various habitats, nest in various places, but especially sort of pre-existing holes in dead wood and plants. Occasionally nest in sandy soils, but not too often. And it will use bee hotels as well. And it's sort of May to September is kind of the general kind of time period it is active. You can see by the map how widespread it is across the UK, not including the Channel Islands where it's not present, and it's patchy distribution in Ireland, but you see it's very patchy in Scotland as well. It's very much more along the southwest coast really. But yeah, very widespread species. Again, this is wide variety of different plants, including the Fabaceae and Asteraceae sort of families. Use a variety of different things to line their nests. And when it comes to identifying these, the females have got a pollen brush that's all orange with a black tip. So if you remember in the first species we covered in the patchwork leafcutter bee, the female's got an all orange pollen brush. So this one's orange and then goes black. If we've seen in Lignoseca and Maritima in the wood carving and the coast leafcutter bee, that pollen brush was quite like a palish sort of off-white at the base, then it went slightly orange and went black. So it's different to those 2 as well. So it's, you know, looking for orange, quite obvious orange, and then going distinctly black towards the tip is the kind of key feature really there. They've got the hairs at the tip of the abdomen are flattened, stuck to the surface, in contrast to some of the other species. And also that Turgite 6 tip of the abdomen is also quite pointed, whereas it was quite blunt, as we've seen in the wood carving leafcutter bee. So there's like some of the features that you can kind of look at. The males are one of the males that, you know, haven't got the mittens at the front. They haven't got that obvious V-shaped notch as we've seen in Lignoseca males. So you can kind of rule out that species. You rule out Leachella, the silvery leafcutter bee, because they haven't got the bright green eyes. and then they basically don't really leave you with many then, does it? So Centrum calaris would be kind of the only one left, and the patchwork leafcutter bee, and that's kind of where you've got to look at the underside of the abdomen, which is quite difficult. But they're called brown-footed because the males often got like a reddish sort of brown feet, which is quite useful for identifying them. And yeah, they're just a little bit sort of darker really in the males of the patchwork leafcutter bee. And this is just kind of looking at the underside of the abdomen there. And you've seen in that earlier picture where the male, where it had much more obvious hair bands going across the abdomen, and it was not so much shiny, basically, and especially this sternite 4 here, you know, that was really dull, whereas it's shiny in this species, in this species, which might be a little bit hard to tell from the picture, but, you know, very difficult things to see. So coming towards the end now, this is just a comparison now quite nicely between the coast leafcutter bee and the Willoughby's leafcutter bee on the right. So you can see in the coast leafcutter bee, you know, it's got the mittens like the Willoughby's does, but you can see that really swollen hind tibia in Maritima and the coast that you don't get in Willoughby ella. So that's a nice comparison. And the other species got the mittens, and the circumcincta, the black-headed one, would have much more narrower, I suppose, little mittens. And then final species, just to touch on very quickly, is Willoughby ella, which is a large species that's widespread across Britain and Ireland, more localized in Scotland and Ireland. Is our most common leafcutter bee, found in a wide variety of different habitats, nest in all various places, usually pre-existing holes, but these are the ones that you often get nest in, like in sort of plant pots in your garden, in like hose pipes, in door frames or window frames, you know, all sorts of manner different things, as well as big hotels. And it's sort of present sort of on the wing from May to September. You can see a distribution map, which the Irish records aren't on the map there, but you can kind of see it is present, you know, quite widely across the whole of the UK, but especially sort of England and Wales, and then becomes a little bit more patchy further north. There's a wide variety of different plants, you know, again, the same sort of families, you know, quite heavily used, the legume families, the Fabaceae, as well as the Asteraceae, the daisy family. But I so strongly associate it with birds of trefoil, especially, you know, it's going to be a really good plant. If you find a good patch of birds of trefoil, then, you know, have a good chance of finding this species. And then to identify the species, then it's a little bit similar to versicolor, I suppose, in the fact that it's got this orange pollen brush that goes black at the tip. It has these upright hairs at the tip of the abdomen, which versicolor didn't have. And then the top of the thorax is usually sort of brown haired, like in the coast leafcutter bee Maritima, it was very dark, if you remember, quite often. And then it has like a fringe on the tibia that is not as long as it is in Maritima. So there's a few different things you can kind of use really to identify this species. And then in the males, we've just kind of had a look at some of the pictures, the comparison really, but the males, you know, they got the mittens, but then they've got normal hind tibia. They're not strongly swollen like they are in Maritima. And they've also got more teeth on the jaws as well. So they got four little teeth on the jaws rather than 3 that you get in the other species in Maritima. So yeah, so there's a few different features there. And this is just a quick comparison really between the patchwork leafcutter bee that we looked at earlier and the brown-footed versicolor on the right there, just to show obvious banding on the underside of the abdomen, less obvious on the right there, and then duller on the left and shinier on the right, but, you know, very subtle things really. So yeah, just by way of summary then really, so I know that was a hell of a lot to cover, but you'll be able to watch this back on YouTube to have a refresh. But we got 7 species of leafcutter bee in the UK. 3 are associated with sandy habitats, so it's really useful to know that. We have males of 3 species that have got these expanded white front feet, front tarsi. And then the pollen brush's color is really important as well, so for the females. So it's all orange in the patchwork leafcutter bee. It's silver or white in Silvery leafcutter bee. It's orange with a black tip in the brown-footed and Willoughby's. And then it's basically got buff, so, you know, quite a pale white with a black tip then in the coast leafcutter bee and Lignoseca, the wood carving leafcutter bee. So that's very useful to know as well. So I know that took a little bit longer than an hour, but hopefully that was quite useful, and you've got a few different pointers from that. But I appreciate there's a huge amount of stuff to cover, even for such a small little group like this in an hour.
Thank you very much indeed, Liam. That was incredibly comprehensive.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a lot to cover, even though it's only 7 species.
Yeah. I thought 7 species. We might be finished in in a matter of minutes. But it's they're clearly there's a lot to them, a lot to their identification, and pretty interesting group ecologically. But yeah, this is you got a hell of a lot in there in that hour.
Yeah, sorry, overrun a bit.
No, that's brilliant, and I'm sure it'll be a great resource for people to come back to. Actually, you really covered every detail possible, I think. And we have got a few questions though. I think the first one was really what I was kind of thinking as well, because circumcincta. I think when you showed the distribution map, that didn't have the latest square on the Sefton Coast in Lancashire. But the first question was a more broader question about that species from an I. Clark, asking, given that circumcincta is polylectic, what is behind its steep decline?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. So hard to say, really, isn't it? To be honest, I'm not 100% sure. In the southeast of England, where it's largely been lost, it's been lost from inland sites. So they're largely talking of like things like sort of heathlands, which are obviously a habitat that's had a lot of pressure over the years. So habitat loss would probably be a big driver, really, within more inland areas of England, I would say. On the coast, then, though, especially as you're going further west and north, then those large complex sand dunes have been relatively stable in the last several decades, but there has been a large loss of them, over the centuries, of course. So yeah, I probably say its habitat loss is quite a big driver as well, but I'm not quite sure whether climate change might be having a role as well. But I don't fully know the answer to that, actually. So it's one of the little bit of an unknowns, to be honest. But I would have thought habitat loss is quite of a big driver, especially inland sites away from the coast. But of course, we still get development on coastal sites now, so that could still be a big threat, on coastal sites as well.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I was looking at Stephen Fawkes. On his Flickr, he talks about them, doesn't he, with his photos, saying it's it's scarce and absent from many apparently suitable sites. So that kind of suggests there's a lack of full understanding.
Yeah, it's a lots to learn, isn't it, about things all the time.
Yeah, but there's a good, there's a good, there's a lot of recording of the culeates going on the Sefton Coast. So I think they would pick it up, and if the females are pretty distinctive as well.
Yeah.
So, and that is amazing sand dune system. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe it's still there.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay, thanks, Liam. So the next question in the chat came from Anne, and it said, wood carving, do they prefer deciduous wood or use conifer too? There's more resin, question mark.
Deciduous, as far as I'm aware. I'm not aware of them using conifers. Not to say they might not, but in my experience, is almost always deciduous. Is kind of what I associate them with. So I'm thinking the last nest that I found, that was in a willow in a salix, I think it was. So yeah, deciduous, I would say. Where I'd imagine it's for the reasons it just touched on with the resin. Being in conifers, there's got to be quite a limiting factor. You don't want to be chewing through things and your jaws are getting all bunged up. It can't be very good, I'd imagine. Yeah, deciduous, I'd say.
Okay, great. Okay, another question from from I. Clark. When the females lay eggs, what mechanism or process controls the order in which male and female eggs are laid? That's the first part of the question. And
Right.
the second one,
Yeah.
actually, the second question is quite different. So,
Oh, okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to bees as to how the female almost decides as to what sex she's going to produce, because she has that ability to decide whether she's going to lay male or female eggs, which is quite interesting. So the males develop from unfertilized eggs, so she can just literally just lay unfertilized eggs and they will become males. And then she'll only lay the fertilized eggs, are the ones that are going to become the females. So she can basically choose between laying unfertilized and fertilized. How she comes to decide that, there's a lot of things we don't really know what the cues are really there, and I'm not quite sure the mechanism of how she physically does it to be honest, but yeah, obviously she'll decide really that she wants to put the females that are more valuable further into the nest, further into the dead wood or into the bee hotel, and then the males, which are a bit more expendable because they develop from unfertilized eggs, they need less pollen and nectar, so they need to provision less in the nest for them. They're more expendable. They can go near the entrance where they could potentially get predated or parasitized by sharp-tailed bees or other cuckoo bees, or wasps and that sort of thing. It's quite interesting when you kind of go into it really. But some nests, the females will lay all males, the nests they lay all females. It all varies really, individual to individual, and the environmental factors will be a really key thing as well. I guess if there's plentiful food about where she can collect loads of pollen, then she can afford to create more females, which require larger brood cells with more pollen. If his resources are really sparse, then she might produce some males, which need less pollen, less leaf sections, smaller brood cells. So there's all these different factors going on really, but ideally the female wants to produce more females because the females are almost guaranteed to reproduce, whereas a lot of male bees never reproduce, they never mate, so they're almost just flying sperm. A lot of them you can think of, so a lot of them never really come to anything, unfortunately. But, I don't think I've really answered the question, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an insight.
No, it's fascinating really. There's obviously a lot of there's a lot to balance for the female, a lot of the decision process of where to.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And also how far she got to forage as well. If she got to travel long distances, she can't produce so many offspring, so she might prioritize producing a few female instead. Or it's lots of things going on.
Lots of process, isn't there? There's not. Yeah. Wow. There's always a lot of potential research, isn't there?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, and then there was another question from I. Clark immediately after. Is there a surefire way of distinguishing female Willoughbyella and Lignus seca?
Yeah, so between those two species, they both superficially look quite similar. They both got black tips to the pollen brush on the underside of the abdomen, right at the very base, so sort of closer towards the thorax, basically on the underside. It'll be more of a dirty white, and then it'll go sort of slightly orange, and then it'll go black at the tip in Lignus seca. And then in Willoughbyella, it should just be more just orange, then going black. So that should be kind of a useful feature. And I can't quite remember the upright hairs or not upright hairs now, which ones had it and which ones didn't have it. I think they both got it on the upright hairs, I think, if I remember correctly. So that's kind of what I kind of go on more than anything, the pollen brush, color. But again, you've got to be really mindful of, the fact that if they got pollen on the pollen brush, you can't really see the colors. So be really careful with that. But the females, of the Lignus seca should be a bit more chunkier, bigger heads, have the real preference for thistles as well. So if you're seeing biggish size leafcutter bees on things like spear thistle, then it's more likely to be Lignus seca as well over Willoughbyella. But they're not easy, the females, I don't think, because of the pollen brush getting covered in pollen. That's the biggest hindrance basically when it comes to identifying them. Whereas at least in the males, you can look for mittens and, kind of separate them out 3 and 4 quite easily, Yeah, it's not easy sometimes to identify these things. You know.
Is that pretty doable in the field? Those separating those two females.
Yeah, it is doable. Yeah, so obviously, as with a lot of these things, it's easier with specimens and that, but a lot of people don't want to collect specimens. And to be honest, I don't really collect specimens of female leafcutter bees. You know, I do them all in the field. But yeah, so it's definitely doable. Just need kind of a good view, really, of the sort of abdomen, and see the pollen brush, and that sort of thing. Not obscured in pollen. But always, take as many pictures as you can if you're not collecting specimens from various different angles, and hopefully they'll have enough to work with that somebody will be able to identify them. And one thing we didn't really touch on in the talk really was identification, really, and where you can go. But there's Stephen Falk's, field guide is really useful. There's another book by George Else and Mike Edwards, which is a bit more hardcore, basically, if you wanted to really go serious into it. And then there's big keys in that as well. And then the Stephen Falk's guide is pretty amazing. He's got his Flickr site as well, I mean, that you touched on. It's got amazing resource of pictures and information as well, that I'm sure you guys can kind of send out to people as well. And then there's a Facebook group as well, with the Bees, Wasps and Ant recording thing on Facebook. I can't remember what it's called now. UK Bees, Wasps and Ants, I think it's called, isn't it? So that Facebook group is really useful if you see any bees and you took pictures of them and you want help with identification. And then there's always people to email as well, like myself or others. So lots of people out there to help you.
Yeah, I don't know how people did it 10 or 15 years ago without all these things. This might be a really silly question, but I know some people use CO2 to knock things out very briefly so that they can do them in the field. Could you kind of wipe the pollen brush to be able to see it better if if you've got that 60 seconds to
yeah. I suppose you could do, couldn't you? Depends whether you feel super guilty about taking all the pollen away from a female that's just collected. But I personally
not taking its life, I suppose.
Yeah. But yeah, better than taking the life, though. Yeah, definitely. But quite often, when you see these things, there's usually others around in the area, so you can kind of wait for a better example of one to come past. That's maybe not obscured in pollen, or but there's sometimes you're lucky in it that you'll see more than one. That might make it a bit easier. But yeah, I suppose you could if you really wanted to use those CO2.
But I guess if you're with experience as you've amassed, it'll be more than it'll be kind of a jizz as well. You'll get used to the size and the way they're moving. And
yeah,
it'll be pretty confident pretty quick.
Yeah, it's difficult when you start, isn't it, to know what's small and what's large, and all that different things, isn't it? But yeah, you get familiar with the habitats as well, don't you? And you associate certain species with certain habitats more than others. And like we've touched on the sandy habitats and stuff, and that's where you'd be aware of those species. And if you're not in sandy habitats, you would rule out those kind of 3 species and, things like that. So there's always a process of elimination, you can rule things out, quite easily. So although we've got 7 species, you can kind of rule things out quite quickly sometimes. They're definitely not that, they're definitely not that. And usually you need to do with a few options, which is quite nice.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Sandra Jones. Thank you. Do the young ever take 2 years to emerge? Thinking of cleaning bee hotels if they haven't emerged by May.
Not quite sure in leafcutter bees, but it certainly happens in mason bees, in the osmias. So the orange-vented mason bee, Osmia leoniana, which does use bee hotels quite a bit, then that is known to take 2 years to develop sometimes. So certainly happens with the leafcutter bee, so with the mason bee, sorry. So I wouldn't see why it wouldn't happen potentially, with some leafcutter bees, if the mason bees are also doing that. So yeah, something to be mindful of, I think, definitely, and maybe if they haven't hatched 1 year, whether that's mason bee cocoons or leafcutter bee ones, and they haven't emerged 1 year, then doesn't mean they're necessarily dead. They might be waiting till the year after, So yeah, do be mindful of it. I don't think it's particularly common, but it could happen,
Okay, great. Okay, question from Carla Lynn. Other than those that favour sandy habitat, do we know why the distribution looks so biased towards coastal regions?
Yeah, it's largely to do with the bees are warmth-loving species, or the vast majority of our bee species are warmth-loving. So if you imagine, like on the coast, it's generally tend to be a lot drier, warmer than it is inland, which tend to be uplands that are cold and wet and often foggy and that sort of stuff. So it's a warmth is kind of a key thing, really, as well as you get more of those sort of well-connected habitats quite often on the coast as well. And even though a lot of our coastline is very urban, you do get quite a long continuous corridors of quite flowery habitat on you as well. So but I think it's more the warmth really is kind of the key thing, really. That's why the southeast of England has got like the highest bee diversity really in the UK, and it becomes less and less the further north and west you go. So so warmth is kind of key, really. And with climate change, things will start to move a bit more as well, and things will move further north and further westwards, as we're seeing with a lot of other bees.
Yeah, great. Okay, question from Arfon Hughes. Sorry, I'm saying that wrong. Is it possible to identify the species from the sealed entrance?
No, unfortunately not. Not that I'm aware of, anyway, because they're like often, well, they're all using kind of leaf sections to various degrees, I suppose. So we can rule out the sandy soil species, because they're in the ground, but in sort of like leaf sections within deadwood and bee hotels, and that's going to be one of 4 species. And yeah, unfortunately, they're all using all manner of different leaf sections, and you can't really identify them based on what leaf sections they're using and things like that. You can, I think, with some species, a bit more like of a preference for using like petals rather than leaves. I think that might be the patchwork, but don't count me on it. But you might be able to narrow it down a little bit, but unfortunately not. It's not as easy as in like the mason bees, where you've got like the mud for the red mason bee, and then chewed up leaf material for like one of the Osmia leniana or the orange vented or something. It's not quite as straightforward, unfortunately, with the leaf cutters. Just have to see them in the process of doing it, basically, I guess, and see the pollen brush and other things like that.
Oh well.
Well.
Okay, another question from I. Clark. Why do leafcutter bees have a tendency to flick their abdomens up in the air when collecting pollen?
Oh, that's quite useful. Good question. I'm trying to think. I don't know whether anyone else would have thought on this, but I've certainly seen them, with their abdomen sticking up to stop the males from coming and mating with them when they're foraging. So it's like a way to kind of get them away. I've certainly seen them do that, because the males will keep pestering them all the time, really, looking for unmated females. So it might be a way to kind of tell the females about, tell the males that they've already mated and they're collecting pollen and that sort of thing. But it might be something to do with the actual pollen collection as well. So I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Liana, about that, but
yeah, I just assumed it was because that's helping them collect more pollen.
But
I've seen them flick up when the males come towards them as well.
Yeah, there might be. I see Louise has commented as well, hasn't she? But, they lift their tail when foraging when the pollen brush is full. That's what Louise has said. There are. Every day's a school day, see?
So they don't knock off when they've already
clever, isn't it? Yeah. So I suppose if the pollen brush is full then, but they still want to gather a bit of nectar for themselves or something, then that's where they might lift them up as well.
Right.
Thanks for that, Louise, by the way. Very helpful.
Great. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions in the chat. Would anyone like to unmute themselves and speak a question? If you still got any? There's lots of praise is coming throughout, Liam.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a torrent. Is there anybody with any other questions for Liam while you have the chance? Okay, there's a question in the chat from Vivian Russell. Hi, Vivian. I hope you're well. What does the chyle in Megachile mean? I think it's the labrum.
I did have this in my talk and I took it out. That do I know what it meant now? I don't know if I can remember what it was now. No, I don't think it's going to come to me. No, I do know, but I can't record it at the moment. So sorry about that. But could well be something to do with the mouth parts, you know, because they do have pretty crazy mouth parts, I guess, don't they? The way they cut leaf sections and stuff. So it could well be to do with the labrum. Yeah, sorry, Vivian. Can't quite remember that. But,
okay, is a question from Sabina George. I haven't seen the usual number of leaf cutters this year. Is this common?
Yeah, it's been one of those years, isn't it? I know a lot of people have said the same about all sorts of different things, and they butterflies and ecology bees and you name it, basically. But yeah, it's been a very, very poor year, unfortunately. It's just you know, with ecology bees, you'll find that they're very, very fussy, and they really will only fly in quite sunny conditions. And there's been relatively few of them this year. I don't know if it's been the same wherever you are in the UK, but certainly in South Wales, it's been very miserable and quite wet and a lot of overcast days, which is not ideal at all. So it hasn't been really good conditions for them to get out and really do a lot of foraging and, you know, obviously create loads and loads of brood cells and loads of young for next year. So you know, they've gone up and done this stuff, but they probably haven't been as successful and haven't raised as many offspring as they would in a more typical year, I guess. So it'd be interesting to see next year now as to kind of what the numbers are like, and hopefully we'll have a better year for them, I hope, anyway. But yeah, just all down to the weather, effectively, and more to do with the overcastness, really, and wet days rather than actually anything else, really. Because, you know, as long as you've got sun, you know, it doesn't matter if it's cold, you know, as long as you've got sun, that's kind of the key thing, really. But yeah, just having enough sunny days, too many dull days and wet days.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of people who have written about where Megachile comes from in the chat.
Oh, brilliant.
We'll read out from Kiss Tamas. The scientific name Megachilidae refers to the genus Megachile, translation roughly as large-lipped. There you go. Their large lips and strong jaws are well suited for collection of bee building materials. Ancient Greek. There we go. From Megas, big. Kilios, lip. So there we go.
Very cool.
Okay, great. Well, yes, unless anyone else has any other questions for Liam, I think we'll call that a night. But yeah, yes, it's been great, Liam. Yeah, and really quite a well. You can see the engagement by the number of questions that people have. Oh, here we go. Another question from Vivian. Just quickly. Do you know anything about usurpation?
Yeah, well, I know a bit about it, I suppose. That yeah, if the nesting sites are quite favoured, you know, by some females, then they will sort of go into the nest that have already been completed, essentially, and chuck out all of the pollen and then, you know, and the eggs and, you know, all that sort of stuff in the leaf sections, and they'll start their own nests in there. But yeah, it's a bit mad sometimes because you see loads of, like a bee hotel, for instance, got loads of empty little bamboo, you know, little things, and then, you know, you have one of them that's been filled, and then another female will come along, empty the one that's been filled, you know, and not use the other ones. Yeah, I don't really know why they do it, to be honest, other than they just want that spot. And if it's taken, then they'll sometimes chuck out the other sort of offspring that's already in there, which is a bit sad. But that's nature for you, isn't it? It's a doggy dog world out there, or a bee world or something. But, it's hard. But yeah, I don't know much else about it other than they will do it, to be honest. So after all that, That's probably not too helpful, Vivian. Sorry.
No, that's great. Okay. All right, then I think we will we'll leave it there for this evening. But thank you very much to everyone for coming, and thanks again to Liam.